Okay, welcome to another video lecture. I'm trying something new. I'm trying this on my laptop, so hopefully it works out. We'll see how it goes, and yeah, well, as usual, we'll just go with it. Russian Revolution. Questions to be asked. What is a revolution? You have some background knowledge to this. You've studied the French, the American, the Industrial Revolution, so we know at this point that a revolution is something that creates some type of systemic or fundamental change in society, and it has to last quite a long time. So the Russian Revolution can be characterized as that because obviously it would lead to the creation of a communist state which lasted over 80 years. And of course communism still exists in the world today, so we can see that. If you look at the examples of why the French Revolution, the American Revolution happened, it's what you often have, and to a certain extent the Industrial Revolution, is you have a small group of people with a lot of power and a large group of people with very little power who desperately want change. Of course, the small group doesn't want change, but so at some point there has to be a big push put forward, either violently or non-violently, to create some type of change in society. To begin with, some background on the empire itself. Many different nationalities. It is an empire at this point, not a country. Prior to 1919 and the treaties that were signed, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, parts of Poland, parts of Finland, they're all part of the Russian Empire. Only 40% of the Russian Empire actually spoke Russian. The absolute monarchy under the Tsar had an extreme amount of loyalty from Russians, but not necessarily from other groups. There was a lot of racial and prejudicial attacks known as pogroms. There were government-sponsored attacks by a group called the Cossacks, particularly on the Poles and the Finns. So he didn't have support in all of his empire, that was for sure. But within his empire, huge celebrations when he came to power. He was known as the Little Father of Russia. And there he is there. So some items about Tsarist Russia. Tsar Nicholas II, crowned in 1894. Absolute divine ruler. So you know from your history that a divine ruler is put there by God, and he believed this. And of course their power is based in religion. The Orthodox Church in Russia was extremely powerful, in particular, not dissimilar to France prior to its own revolution, with the peasant classes. They believed God placed him in his position, so very powerful. He had a feudal-like control. He had a secret police known as the Okhrana that would quell any type of problems that were occurring within his country. And the Cossacks, again, those regiments were brutal in pushing any resistance to reform down. Again, the full support of the church at this time. Some weird things about him, though. He wanted to pay a lot of attention to the day-to-day details of running his country instead of the big picture, so he'd get bogged down, almost micromanaging himself into the ground. And he feared competent ministers, often firing them, almost scared that they would perhaps make him look weaker. And in his place of these competent positions, he'd put friends, patronage appointments, and so they were based obviously on friendship and relationship, not on their ability to actually do an effective job. On the demographics themselves, 80% of the population were peasants, living in the communes in the countryside. Some did well. Kulaks, for instance, did well, but for the most part, very poor lives, life expectancy very low, around 40. Famine and starvation was common. Land was in short supply in Russia, which seems weird given the size of it, but a lot of the land was unsuitable for farming. It's too cold, or arid regions. It just wasn't good. So what was left was often put into land strips. So if you think of the seigneurial system that you learned in grade 9 in New France, similar to that. They had lords called mirs that would dole out these strips to the peasant class, and basically as the families grew and the population grew, they'd have to split up those land strips. So land was quickly running out. The peasants were loyal. Again, they didn't have much education, so much of their belief system was based in religion at the time, so they were very loyal based on this divine right that the Tsar had. But at the same time, there were some resentful over land, and they supported these social revolutionists, which we'll talk about in a bit. The aristocracy, 1.5% of the population, but they own 25% of the land, so that gives you an idea there. They acted as the local officials, and no doubt because of their position, they wanted to maintain the status quo. Many of them lived glamorous lives in the cities, so they were absentee landlords. They never actually lived in the areas of the land that they owned. They had one major fear, and that was a peasant revolt over land. The status quo is what most conservative groups like because, again, those are people in power. So we'll find that through most of the ideologies we talk about, when you look at the right wing or the conservative wing, they want to focus on sort of that status quo or keeping things the same. Obviously, the left wing, which produces change, traditionally wants things to change because they're not in a good position. So like most people, they want to keep what they have or gain new things. I'm not advancing here. Weird. There we go. Strange. Industrial working class. So industry was occurring in a small way in Russia, mostly in the western part or the European part of Russia. The Tsar did support industry. He thought it was a good thing. Didn't really have a clue how to necessarily bring it about, but he thought it was a good thing to sort of bring Russia into that European model. Peasants left land to work in the cities, so very industrial, revolutionary tale there, but terrible living and working conditions. No regulations for industry, and the unions themselves became illegal. St. Petersburg, the capital, and Moscow, they were the ones that had most of the people, so you'd have the filth of the working class contrasted by the beautiful winter palace of the Tsar, and it was just an example of a huge class difference within the people of Russia. All powers really had regulations. So by powers I mean Britain, France, etc. had regulations on industry. And this just showed the Tsar didn't really understand, had no understanding of how to grow his country at this point. He just knew that industrialism was a good thing and he wanted it. Another big effect of this somewhat growing industry of the major cities in the West was the growing population of capitalists. So this is your bourgeoisie. Before, it would always be lawyers, writers, teacher, intellectuals. That was your bourgeoisie or your middle class. Very, very small group. These were capitalists, and they had money behind them that they had made through industry. And they began to sort of push a revolution in a very similar way to what we saw, again, in the French Revolution. Some problems in Russia. Why would you revolt if there were no problems? Big time lack of food and resources. So we're talking about the peasants. Industrialization, haphazard, economy weak. So these are the working conditions, and the middle class is upset, including the capitalists. They want more democracy, to be able to make decisions, to build their economy, because they felt the Tsar didn't really know how to build an economy at this time. You had workers' strikes. Socialist revolutionaries used the conditions to cause problems quite often. World War I eventually would happen, and then that's a huge strain on an economy to begin with, and when you have a weak economy, that even is worse, plus men being sent to the front in a war of attrition didn't make people happy about that at all. And of course, just the poor leadership at this time, mentioned earlier by the Tsar, not really having a clue in how he was basically taking the power away from his ministers every time they had success. So what happened was you had things occurring like the idea that the social revolutionaries were pushing this idea of carving up land estates and redistributing them to peasants. Well, this sounded good to peasants because they didn't have land and they thought the aristocracy had too much, so they wanted to have some of it for themselves. But what eventually would happen is they'd split into two groups, Mensheviks and Bolsheviks. And basically, Bolsheviks wanted revolution, Mensheviks said they were not ready yet. Many of these, of course, were exiled because they were found out by the Okhana or the Cossacks, and so they would be exiled or they would flee for their own lives. This is where we start to see a division between what's known as Marxism, which we've explored a little bit, and what we'll continue to explore, Leninism. Speaking of Mr. Marx, workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. A very famous quote. And this pretty much puts the whole thing into context. It was all about, it's a workers' revolution. So a big shift of power from the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, to what's known as the proletariat, the working class, the people within the factories themselves. You have communal ownership of means of production, no need for government. And the biggest problem with this was Russia wasn't industrialized. You need an industrialized country to have Marxism take place, and the revolution, he said, to take place. Well, Russia didn't have it. So you can see Lenin realized this, and he wasn't willing to wait around like a Menshevik, so he wanted to push the revolution forward. This is an ideology. We've never actually seen Marxism in practice. Marxism is not communism. No government in the end of all of this. It's just simply not happening. It does ignore some pretty common human traits of nature, the thirst for power, the selfishness of human beings, greed, competition. It really was based in a utopia. And it sounds like a beautiful thing. Everyone working in, for the betterment of everyone else and not trying to get ahead of their neighbor. But, just from life, we know that that doesn't always take place, unfortunately, in all circumstances. So, 1905, things were getting worse. There was a small revolution in 1905. There's actually two revolutions within Russia. The one we focus on is 1917 because it's where the change occurred and the Tsar abdicated. But in 1905, there was a revolution. At this point, the Tsars failed to solve the problems that I've outlined before. He tried to start a war with Japan to unite in some glorious victory, and ended up being a huge failure, and in fact an embarrassing one. One catalytic event known as Bloody Sunday, in which you have, excuse me, a priest named Gapon led 200,000 people in protest on the Winter Palace. The Tsar wasn't even there, but basically the decision was made in his absence to shoot and kill most of the crowd by the army and the Cossack regiments. It was a brutal pushdown of this, basically a protest. Now the Tsar had lost the people, and not only that, he'd lost Father Gapon, a very well-known priest within the city of St. Petersburg. So remember, religion is his power base. When you're losing priests and your religion is your power base, this is not a good thing. So his response, 10 months later, I should say Bloody Sunday was in January of 1905, 10 months later he issued something called the October Manifesto. So again, showed this not understanding that a response was needed. It did give some type of democracy, which split his opposition. The middle class thinking, oh, that's good, but then you have your revolutionary groups of, Lenin and Trotsky-led Bolsheviks thinking, no, we need to push this revolution. So while they were kind of deciding how we should move next after this response, the Tsar made peace with Japan, and the army, for the most part, came back, and they brutally crushed any type of revolt or reform that was being pushed by any of these groups. And so basically by 1906 it was over, and he made something called fundamental laws, which made any elected body that he did give in the October Manifesto completely and utterly useless. I'm going to finish off with a video, Capitalism versus Communism, and this is just something for you to watch. It's kind of a funny one, but it does have some elements within it. So let's see if I can just get out of this, pull this down, and I gotta find trying to think of the name. The video does apply somewhat, but this is just a small background into Tsarist Russia. And you'll be needing this information moving forward. So, feel free to pause this at any point, take some information down. I know I went very quickly, but just giving you some highlights. We will be looking into this a bit closer as individuals and as a class, but I just want to make sure I give you some background information from it.